Good evening. My name is Ali Abunimah. I grew up in a house with two parents, both born in Palestine, who both lived through the Nakba, the 1948 ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Their lives and mine were shaped by what happened in that year and ever since, including the 1967 Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip that continues to this day. Although I was raised in Europe, you could say I grew up with the Palestinian quest for justice in my blood. But it wasn't until I came to university in the United States at the height of the First Intifada, the Palestinian uprising, in 1989, that I began to seriously study the question of Palestine in its legal and political aspects. As I began to read about international law, I kept coming across the writings of Richard Falk. Even before I had read a word by the great Palestinian-American intellectual Edward Said, I was already learning from Richard Falk. I never imagined that all these years later, I would have the honor of introducing him at an event like this tonight. So this is a very special occasion for me. Now, there are many things I could tell you about Professor Falk's long and distinguished career. He is currently a research professor at the University of California at Santa Barbara. For 40 years, until 2001, he was professor of international law at Princeton University. During that time, he has written, edited, or contributed to, and I'm not kidding, dozens of books. Many of his works on international law are standard references for teachers and students on that subject. I could read you the very long list I have here, but that would take up too much time, and I would rather you hear from the person himself. But the thread that runs through Richard Falk's work, in my mind, is that though his conceptions of international law are as forensic and precise as any law professor's, and his knowledge is unparalleled, it is in no way abstract. His understanding of how the law can and should function is deeply rooted in an analysis of where power lies and how it works. I'm reminded of the line from the movie version of Herman Melville's Billy Budd. At the court-martial of the title character on false charges of mutiny, Lieutenant Seymour states, "We do not deal with justice here, but with the law." Law and justice are so often divorced from each other in our world, if not polar opposites altogether. Richard Falk insistently brings these concepts back together. One of his bold moves several decades ago was to argue the case that nuclear weapons were not only immoral, but in fact illegal as well. He thereby contributed to creating a legal framework for their eventual abolition and demonstrated his belief in the emancipatory, indeed revolutionary potential of the law. He's also written more recently about how it was civil society activism that was instrumental to bringing about the creation in 2002 of the International Criminal Court. It is an institution that has yet to prove itself as a true venue for justice, as opposed to a venue merely for the law of the strong. But his analysis holds out the real prospect that this can still happen if we demand it. A more recent test of his principles, of his ethics, came when he served as UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories from 2008 to 2011. I cannot put it more eloquently than he does in the opening to his 2014 book, Palestine, The Legitimacy of Hope. Quote, in my UN role, and as a commentator on the realities I perceive in relation to the question of legal and moral rights that I have devoted my adult life to studying, my efforts are premised on being a truthful observer and progressive interpreter. This means, in relation to Israeli policies and practices, allowing my inquiry to enter zones declared off-limits by the many avid defenders of what is called Brand Israel, including many of the most prominent and influential American liberals. End quote. It is precisely because of Falk's meticulous commitment to these principles in practice that Israel expelled him from the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip in 2008 to ensure that these zones, where Israel has committed so many war crimes, do remain off limits. But that never stopped him, and as a result, Richard Falk has been subjected to repeated personal attacks and vicious character assassination. In my experience, he writes, especially here in the United States, no discussion is more distorted by the constraints of political correctness and ideological bias than that on Israel and Palestine, end quote. Indeed, the attacks on those who insist on entering the off-limit zones are becoming more intense, especially against students and faculty on campuses. These are well-funded campaigns by anti-Palestinian groups. One example of these vicious attacks came in 2013 when the Los Angeles-based Simon Wiesenthal Center released its top 10 list of what it claimed are the most virulent anti-Semites. It put the Iranian supreme leader in first place, followed by Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and there in third place was Richard Falk. It is easy to dismiss such antics as hyperbole, but as many can attest, they have a real detrimental effect on those who are so defamed, but they also have, and are intended to have, a chilling effect on those who fear for their careers or reputations. And such false attacks used to shield Israel, a colonial apartheid state, are a form of crying wolf. They make it much harder to fight, as we must, against real bigotry, including against Jewish people, as well as against the rampant Islamophobia and entrenched anti-black racism that is loose in this country. And of course, recently we have heard renewed attacks on immigrants, particularly Mexicans and refugees, becoming an ever more shrill part of what passes for political debate in this country. There is simply no room in the Palestinian rights movement or in any other anti-racist movement, as ours is and must remain, for any kind of bigotry masquerading as a concern for justice. I'm grateful to Richard Falk for his clarity, and at this moment I can think of no more thoughtful or insightful person for us to be in conversation with tonight about the question of Palestine and so many other crises affecting our world. Please join me in welcoming Richard Falk.
Good evening. I'm particularly moved by Ali Abunimah's introduction. He is, of all those trying to understand the Palestinian issues the most humane and informed and illuminating voice that now is now that we have available. So it's a very moving for me to have been introduced by him in such an unduly flattering way. I'm also very grateful to the Lannan Foundation for their invitation to take part in this lecture series, and especially for the warm hospitality that has been bestowed upon me. At the same time I'm honored by this, I'm also challenged and somewhat intimidated by being grouped with the illustrious speakers that also are part of this series. And it's a particularly, I think, difficult time to address the Israeli-Palestine complex of issues. Let me just say a few things as in a preliminary way, as a background for the main substance of what I will try to talk about. We're at a time when the realities of political life in the Middle East are such to have diverted attention from the unresolved Palestinian struggle for fundamental rights. The attention is focused now, for understandable reasons, on ISIS, the threat it poses, the kinds of terrorist incidents that have been occurring outside the Middle East, and the continuing civil war in Syria. All of these developments make it extremely difficult to give to the Palestinian situation the attention that it deserves. But at the same time, we must appreciate that for the Palestinian people living under occupation or living in refugee camps in neighboring countries, their daily ordeal of suffering is unimaginably severe and has continued over the decades. If you have to have witnessed it to have any sense of the severity of what that means to grow up in an atmosphere created by the refugee camps or the vulnerabilities and statelessness that is associated with living under occupation or in Gaza in a situation of prolonged captivity. There is also a sense that hasn't really existed to nearly the same degree of clarity before, that the diplomatic effort to resolve the conflict, to create the conditions for a sustainable peace, has failed, that it has reached a dead end. The process that was perhaps falsely labeled the peace process that arose out of the Oslo framework of principles that had been agreed upon in 1993, was something that was flawed from the outset, but which was invested with the expectation that this would somehow bring Palestinians an independent state and the realization of the most fundamental of their aspirations, some kind of reasonable form of self-determination. But what has resulted is something that is extremely disillusioning in terms of both the role of the United States as a supposed intermediary and the inability of the parties to find sufficient common ground to move toward peace. With that failure to find common ground, I would assign 80% of the responsibility to Israel because of its disinterest, which has recently become more and more explicit in finding a diplomatic solution to this long conflict. The further aspect of this failure of diplomacy is a realization that the inability to solve the conflict does not affect the two sides equally. Time is definitely helpful to Israel's effort to expand the settlements, to encroach upon the remaining 22% of historic Palestine that has been occupied since 1967. In other words, Israel has gained by the inability to solve the conflict, and the Palestinians have steadily had their material prospects diminished. And this, if you think back historically, this is really true from the time that the Balfour Declaration toward the end of World War I, 1917, originally conferred upon the Zionist movement the expectation of a Jewish homeland. All through the period that the British administered Palestine, both the demographic realities and the political expectations changed in favor of Zionist aspirations and frustrating of the expectations and aspirations of the indigenous Palestinian population. And although the dispossession of the Palestinian people in 1948, the Nakba, was the dramatic recognition of this process of a shifting balance of rights and expectations. It's a process that preceded that traumatic event in 1948 and has continued up to this present moment. So it's not something that can be associated with an event. The Nakba, or the dispossession and the denial of Palestinian rights, is an ongoing process as we speak. A further aspect that seems to me to be fundamental is the degree to which this Palestinian ordeal that has existed now since 1948 and in a more accentuated form since 1967 is something that both the United States and the United Nations have a major responsibility in relation to. And it's important to appreciate that because there is often, particularly in the UN setting, the complaint made, why is Israel being given so much attention, considering that there's so many terrible things happening in the world? But when you think a little bit more carefully about the situation, you become aware that it was the UN that was given the assignment by the United Kingdom when it gave up its control over Palestine. The UN was given the assignment of resolving the problem. And what it did in 1947, through a committee that then issued a set of recommendations that the General Assembly approved, was to impose upon Palestine a partition arrangement, which was also what the British, in their normal colonial fashion, favored toward the end of the mandate. As you know, British colonial policy premised on a divide and conquer ethos left behind many partitioned countries that have experienced a legacy of colonialism that is tragic and caused much suffering and bloodshed. India, Cyprus, Ireland, in addition to Palestine. But in many ways, the worst of these legacies is what has happened in Palestine. And so it's really a matter of saying the UN has shirked its responsibility to find a just solution to this situation that they accepted responsibility for at the very origins of the organization. And what they tried to do through this General Assembly Resolution 181 was to impose a partition that was never a result of what the people living in Palestine wanted at the time. In other words, it completely disregarded the dynamics of self-determination, which were the fundamental ethical premise of the anti-colonial movement and of the degree to which the rights of people that had been in one way or another oppressed were recognized in this period. And the anti-colonial movement that followed World War II, in all its major outcomes, was a vindication of the political as well as the ethical supremacy of the idea of self-determination, which was launched, you may remember, by Woodrow Wilson in World War I, but was overridden by the European colonial powers at that time. And one wonders what the world today would look like had Wilson's diplomacy prevailed at the Versailles peace talks. It was not completely defeated, but it was substantially suppressed through this international instrumentality of the mandate system, which the mandatory powers that were given virtual sovereign authority were vested in the European colonial powers. In the Middle East, it meant England and France. So it's in this against this background, I think, that one understands also the American responsibility as having been the principal supporter of Israel throughout its existence. It has, together with some of the European countries, been the source of Israel's emergence as a military powerhouse in the region. It has protected Israel over the years from accountability to international law. No matter how clear the Israeli violations of international law have been. The United States has been unconditional in its support of Israel. And Secretary of State John Kerry, not long ago, correctly pointed out that there have been hundreds, literally hundreds of occasions in various organs of the United Nations where the United States has blocked criticism or initiatives that censured Israel, even for acts that the United States government itself viewed as legally dubious. In the early years, the U.S. condemned the construction of Israeli settlements on the occupied territory of Palestine. It's moved from calling them illegal to calling them unhelpful, which is I think, a rather good emblematic expression of the degree to which the way in which Israel is treated within the American political system is one where it literally is incapable of doing wrong. See, it's a very unique situation that a foreign government in a foreign country has achieved that kind of impunity, geopolitical impunity, beyond legal impunity. And there is hard to imagine any rupture of normal international behavior that would lead the United States government at this stage to condemn Israeli action as a violation of international law. And that's something that we as Americans should wonder about, why this kind of what I would call negative exceptionalism has emerged, and it's connected with, in this kind of perverse way with American exceptionalism. We can do no wrong, and we take the position that whatever we do in the name of our security transcends any obligations under the UN Charter or under international law. You may remember that George W. Bush told Congress that the U.S. will never ask for a permission slip when its security, ask for a permission slip from the United Nations when its security is in jeopardy. And this has been repeated in a more polite way by Barack Obama. But what was significant about the Bush statement was that it met with thunderous bipartisan applause. In other words, American exceptionalism is deeply embedded in American political culture, that we are not, that we are above the, we're above the threshold of accountability. And international law in the area of war and peace is something that is appropriate for others, but not for ourselves, and not for our closest friend. See, and that's a very exceptional situation. There's a recent book by one of Israel's leading activists, Jeff Halper, who's also a very good writer. And he, I recommend the book strongly. It's called War Against the People. And he poses the question at the outset of the book, how does Israel get away with it? And he goes on to say, and I'm quoting, "In a decidedly post-colonial age, how is Israel able to sustain a half-century of occupation over the Palestinians, a people it violently dispossessed in 1948, in the face of almost unanimous international opposition?" Now, many people have, in one way or another, posed this question, and one of the influential answers was in the book by John Mersheimer and Stephen Walt, that it's the Israeli lobby that has so successfully neutralized, or maybe I should say subjugated, the U.S. Congress, and that makes it politically impossible for a elected leadership to question the fundamental reality of this situation in the Middle East. Noam Chomsky has argued that it's really a matter of strategic convergence, that the United States and Israel have the same strategic goals in the region, and especially since 1967, when Israel showed that it was capable of being a military power in the region, it emerged as a real asset, and this was reinforced by the events in Iran in 1978, where the Shah was overthrown and U.S. lost an ally, and it was further, I think, reinforced by the recognition that no matter how many weapon systems Saudi Arabia bought, they didn't know how to use them. And so it was good for arms sales, but it wasn't good for upholding the regional security objectives that the United States had. The last of these opening remarks that I wanted to make was to express my own motivation in being so concerned with this, with ending the Palestinian ordeal, with achieving a sustainable peace. And it really rests on the view that until those goals are achieved, and for both peoples, both for the Jewish people and the Palestinian people, there is an imperative, a moral imperative, that a peace based on the equality of these two peoples be realized, and that it be accompanied by some acknowledgement of the injustice that has been the experience of the Palestinian people for the decades. Some kind of truth and reconciliation process would be needed. Now, the discouraging aspect of all of this is the difficulty of envisioning how one gets to that goal, how one attains that goal, because all the evidence seems to be pointing toward the denial of a sustainable peace and a continuation of this anguishing situation of occupation, refugee status, and Israeli expansion. And the indications, the surface indications are that what is in the near future, at any rate, is a gradual acknowledgement that what Israel is seeking is a one-state Israeli solution. either in the form of continuing occupation of those parts of Palestine that are where most of the Palestinians live, or in some kind of shift from the de facto annexation that has been taking place in the last several decades to a legalization, at least an Israeli legalization of that situation. And you have a situation now where the president of Israel, Reuven Rivlin, has been a lifelong advocate of a one-state solution, a single Israeli state with civil rights accorded to the Palestinians, and the prime minister being Benjamin Netanyahu, who promised the Israeli people during the electoral campaign of this past March that as long as he's prime minister, there will never be a Palestinian state. And then the person that has been put in the UN on behalf of Israel, Danny Lannan, is a settler extremist who has always advocated annexation and an end to any kind of pretension of relinquishing any part of biblical Israel to the Palestinian people. So one has a situation that is very adverse to what I regard as the minimum realization of peace and justice for both peoples. What I wanted to focus upon and discuss in the time that remains is what I've referred to in my introductory remarks as the special relationship between Israel and the United States, because unless that special relationship is normalized, the political climate will not encourage a proper solution to this festering long-term conflict. And I think it's important for Americans to understand the real dangers and costs that we pay by having such a special relationship. You may remember the George Washington's farewell address for his warning against entangling alliance, what he called entangling alliances. Of course, the world has changed a lot, and the globalization of political life has made it necessary, and I would agree desirable, to have certain kinds of connections, enduring connections with other countries. One thing that Washington said in that farewell address, though, in 1796, I think illuminates part of the difficulty that is associated with the special relationship. And he said there, nothing is more essential than that permanent antipathies against particular nations and passionate attachments to others should be excluded, and that in place of them, just and amicable feelings toward all should be cultivated. And he goes on to say, the nation which indulges toward another a habitual hatred or a habitual fondness is in some degree a slave. It is a slave to its animosity or to its affection, either of which is sufficient to lead it astray from its duty and its interest. And I think that this 18th century language is very perceptive as to the importance of retaining flexibility in foreign policy, both for normative or ethical reasons and to maintain intelligent policy responses to a changing world. And I mention this warning against passionate attachments of Washington's in the context of two other important background elements. I already referred to American exceptionalism, which is a way of, in a sense, giving credibility to international irresponsibility. In other words, others are responsible to maintain some kind of respect for international law, for the UN authority. But because we are who we are, we make up our own mind. We decide what we want to do. And that kind of exceptionalism, combined with this tendency toward either animosity or attachment, creates unstable and polarizing forms of foreign policy. The actual notion of special relationship comes from Winston Churchill, and particularly is associated with his famous speech on the Iron Curtain that was given in Fulton, Missouri. And in the course of that speech, he said the following thing that connects with this analysis that I'm trying to put forward. In Churchill's words, "Neither the sure prevention of war nor the continuous rise of world organization will be gained without what I have called the fraternal association of English-speaking peoples, a special relationship between the British Commonwealth and Empire and the United States." And Churchill made clear that he meant this to involve more than just an emotional bond, but that it would involve security, cooperation, and sharing of intelligence and other more practical embodiments. But what I think is important to recognize is that this kind of special relationship emerged in countries, between countries that were similarly situated, with similar historical backgrounds, and with enduring converging interests. And it was never interpreted or meant to be interpreted as involving an exemption from international accountability. It was a special relationship in terms of values, cultural heritage, common worldview, and essentially a feeling that the interests that were successfully defended in the course of World War II would need to be protected in the post-war period and throughout the Cold War. When you come to the relationship, the special relationship in the Middle East, you have a very different both background and a much more tenuous foundation. Now, Israel is not the only special relationship in the Middle East. Even in some senses more toxic, in my view, is the relationship with Saudi Arabia, which is very hard. I mean, oil counts for lots, and it was clearly the strategic foundation of the original affinity that was established between the United States and Saudi Arabia. And for a long time, it seemed like a sensible, practical way that geopolitics was being implemented. It meant from the outset turning a completely blind eye to the human rights realities of Saudi Arabia. While we lectured many other countries and denounced with some reason, the theocracy in Iran, we completely overlook and continue to overlook a much worse regime of oppressiveness in Saudi Arabia. Just days ago, one of the leading poets of the country was sentenced to death because his poetry was found to be conducive to what the Islamic religious authorities regarded as unsuitable for the people of the country. And they've had more beheadings since the beginning of this year than ISIS is responsible for. And yet you hear not a word. See, that's what this special relationship means, a commitment to what I would call normative blindness, or a kind of myopia that you cannot, you don't see, you learn not to see. But what is more, I think, surprising and almost incomprehensible is the degree to which, since 9/11 particularly, the U.S. overlooks the fact that Saudi Arabia has funded the spread of jihadist extremism throughout the world. It has invested literally billions of dollars in disseminating the most extreme Salafi style version of Islam throughout the madrasas of Asia and the Middle East, and is really responsible in a very direct sense for the rise of Islamic extremism. And yet, this special relationship continues to lead our presidents and our highest officials to welcome the Saudi king as our close friend and ally, and to visit Riyadh as something that is precious to the conduct of American foreign policy. How can we explain this failure to do everything in our power to prevent the continued dissemination of this kind of political ideology that gives rise to such terrifying incidents as occurred in Paris a few weeks ago? And not only this problem of the ideological, what I'd call the ideological dimension of the special relationship, but there's also the degree to which Saudi sectarianism, that is, the promotion of Sunni Islam, has intensified the Syrian civil war, has led to the very destructive and unlawful military intervention that continues to this day in Yemen and has caused enormous civilian casualties. And we have shielded and even supported Saudi uses of force against Yemen and earlier against Bahrain to suppress its uprising in 2011. So here we have a special relationship that seems to go deeply against what you would think would be the most fundamental American interests in stability and containing and discouraging political and religious extremism, and yet we do nothing. And we continue to regard that special relationship as a positive dimension of our foreign policy. Coming to the Israeli version of this special relationship, it also, in a very different form, has, I think, a detrimental effect on the pursuit of American foreign policy and the integrity of any kind of American commitment to the promotion of global justice and the authority of international law. Unlike the Saudi case, the original commitment to Israel has not an oil or resource foundation. It does have a moral and normative explanation. It was very much, I think, nurtured by the feelings of empathy for Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. It also was mixed with a certain amount of guilt by the liberal democracies for their failure to do more to stop the Nazi persecution at an earlier stage. And it was also, I think, aided or strengthened by the idealistic nature of the early Zionist experiences in Israel, both their making the desert bloom and the military success of what appeared to be a tiny country surrounded by hostile neighbors. So it looked like a heroic and very positive experience. And for that reason, it's, I think, understandable that there was this initial attraction that was combined, of course, with the sense of the superiority of European civilization and had certainly a colonialist aspect to it. And what accompanied the formation of this special relationship was an erasure of the Palestinian ordeal and the dispossession. That really wasn't visible. It was off the radar screen. And that permitted a one-sided understanding of the situation and acceptance of the mainstream Zionist narrative. And that, but over the years and over the decades, Israel has paid the cost, in my view, of subjugating the Palestinians, dispossessing them, and denying them fundamental rights. I talked earlier about the material costs that the Palestinians have suffered because delay works against them and has facilitated Israeli expansionism. But the psychological and spiritual costs of suppressing another people over a long period of time has really sacrificed the idealism and the early visionary nature of the Israeli experiment and of the whole notion of what Zionism was trying to achieve. A well-known Israeli political figure, Daniel Levy, who left Israel because he said that Israel is not the country that it used to be. And what he meant by that was this process of dominating and inducing suffering for another people has a backlash that is expressed by cynicism, greed, power, and a kind of materialism that takes the place of the earlier idealism. And so that situation has been obscured by the special relationship, and it's involved excessive military assistance, turning a blind eye toward Israeli acquisition of nuclear weapons, which has greatly complicated the regional situation. It would have been extremely easy to gain a great deal more stability in the Middle East if it was possible to establish a nuclear-free zone, that all the Arab governments, as well as Turkey and Iran, were favorable to. But because of the special relationship, the United States prevents even the discussion of denuclearization coming onto the political agenda, even though Israel has no security need for nuclear weapons and has been assured by the U.S. Congress and the political leaders that it will not only have the capacity to defend itself, but that it will have regional dominance. The commitment of the United States is to assure Israel of what is called in Pentagon jargon, full spectrum dominance. And then, as I referred earlier, there is no willingness to view Israel-Palestinian relationship through the prism of international law or through some kind of accountability to the UN Charter or to the International Court of Justice or to the International Criminal Court. So I think that what the reason I focused on the special responsibility is twofold. One is, I think, unless it's altered, unless the relationship with Israel is normalized, it will be very difficult to find any path to a desirable future. And secondly, I think we as American citizens have a real obligation and individual responsibility to question our political leadership and our Congress for indulging in such seemingly detrimental forms of relationship in the Middle East that is so turbulent and causing so much suffering. Both the relationship with Saudi Arabia and the relationship with Israel should be under serious scrutiny. And it's among the various scandals of the current presidential campaign that these kind of issues are not even discussed. They're below the threshold of discussability. Let me end my remarks by saying a couple of final things. In the 6 years that I served as Special Rapporteur on Palestine at the UN, I became very conscious of two different developments. On the ground, in terms of the situation of the Palestinians, it was consistently getting worse. They lost land, they were living in conditions of captivity and rightlessness. There was a consistent process, and nothing that was being done internationally by way of diplomacy, by way of UN authority, was having any effect on the way in which Israel was seeking to take advantage of the power relationship, which was so asymmetrical. But at the same time, as this was happening, one also was aware of a growing global solidarity movement in support of Palestinian rights and support of Palestinian self-determination. It's expressed often in recent developments in the U.S., especially by church groups and university campuses, in relation to the BDS campaign, or boycott, divestment, and sanctions. It's gone from success to success in the European setting, where major companies have withdrawn their activity in Israel, and generally there has evolved a situation where the Palestinians, while losing the material conflict, have been winning the legitimacy war. And if you look back at the conflicts that were resolved in since 1945, since the end of World War II, the side that prevails is the side that can control the high moral and legal ground. It is the symbolic victories, not the battlefield superiority, that in the end controls the political outcome. This goes against our realist sensibility. But if you look at the conflicts of the past 75 years, you'll see that pattern very clearly emerged. The United States should have learned that lesson in Vietnam, where it had total military superiority, yet lost the war, and never understood that that was a new tendency in history that shifted the balance of forces in the direction of those that could command a nationalist mobilization against foreign and military dominance. And so that, in my mind, that is the basis of hope for the future. And it creates this reality of what I call the politics of impossibility. It looks impossible for the Palestinians to achieve a just outcome. And yet, in our lifetimes, the impossible has happened quite often. In South Africa, it toppled the apartheid regime. In the Soviet Empire, it brought freedom to the peoples of Eastern Europe. The Arab uprisings of 2011 came as a surprise. In other words, we're not smart enough to know the future. And so it is an obligation, an ethical obligation, that we struggle as hard as we can for what we believe is right. And I have no doubt that for both peoples, what is right is a just solution for the Palestinian people. Thank you very much.